Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So this is a jazz guitar, and it's a very specific kind of instrument that was designed back in the 1920s at the beginning of the jazz era. And what you'll notice about it that makes it a jazz guitar are it's got violin-style sound holes and a violin-style tailpiece, and uniquely an arched top and an arched back. So it's really designed based on a violin. And in fact, this guitar is not just a jazz guitar, but it's a handmade acoustic arch top guitar. Again, based on that violin. And the traditions that go into making this instrument are exactly those of a fine violin. The same kinds of materials, same kind of tools, the same kind of years and years of devotion in order to find the perfect balance of acoustic sound that you get from merging a bunch of different pieces of wood together. So the sad fact is that most jazz guitarists will never own an instrument like this or even have a chance to play an instrument like this because they're really so difficult to make and because of a little something called technology. Today, any manufacturer worth of salt is going to dedicate as many resources as they can to building things smarter, more simply, much more accurately, and with better margin. As anybody in business knows, it's kind of the key, is increase output, increase margin, lower costs. Which is fine in most cases, but when it comes to applying technology to things which require an artist's touch and an artist's experience, then at some point there's a diminishing return in the value of the finished good. And so this discussion's really about where we have to strike that balance in order to maintain the artistry in building things that require artistry. I'm guessing there are probably a few wine drinkers in here, so imagine your favorite bottle of California Cabernet Sauvignon or Bordeaux or a great Rhone wine, and your favorite winemaker decides that in order to be a little bit more aggressive with his cost, he's going to pick the grapes exactly the same time every year. He's going to process them exactly the same way. He's going to blend them exactly the same way for the same amount of time. He's going to put them in a barrel exactly the same amount of time with the same number of barrels. And at the end, he's going to bottle a wine and sell it to you that's been managed exactly the same from the time it was picked from the vineyard until the time it goes into your mouth. Well, if you drink wine, you know that that's a process that may work in some cases, but for really fine wines, it takes a great talent and years of experience in understanding what nature gives us to blend into a final product that has some consistency. Guitars are much the same. Most guitarists will play instruments that are made from laminated woods that compromise some acoustic integrity in order to be more easily amplified, but the byproduct is they cost a lot less to manufacture. Unfortunately, even the greatest guitar makers alive today, and this applies to other instruments as well, will take these raw materials that you see on the screen behind me, these two beautiful pieces of book-matched European maple or domestic maple, European spruce or Sitka spruce, that have been aged for years and years, dried as much as they can be tried to be stable, and instead of carving them using their hands in order to determine what the final tonality of that instrument is, they'll use a computer numerically controlled machine that gives them exactly the same dimension every time within a 5 or a 10,000ths of an inch. So they're taking the understanding of a great luthier or instrument maker and putting their trust into a machine, and they're building that instrument in a tenth of the time, with a tenth of the effort, and greatly reduced costs, and they're making it much more consistently than they've ever made it before. It's the consistency that's the problem. Just as with wine, if you line up 100 guitars that were made by a machine using the finest materials, you'll get 100 different outcomes versus someone who spends years developing the skill and practicing the carving of these instruments so that every unique piece of instrument gives the same outcome in the end. That's a balance that's very difficult to strike in modern business and using modern technology. Today, we can't build a Stradivari violin using a 3D printer. In fact, we haven't figured out really how to build one yet, even with the greatest artisans trying to replicate that fine sound. It's the timbre from the wood and how the builder is using the materials at hand at the time that they receive the materials to finally tune those instruments. So it takes a little greater effort to make something like this from a lot of different perspectives. It's greater cost for the musician, and in this case we're talking about jazz musicians, so we know how difficult that can be. It takes a greater cost from the perspective of the builder. It requires extraordinary amounts of time and practice. One of the greatest luthiers of the 20th and 21st century told me that he wishes he could go back and destroy the first 100 instruments he built because he learned how to do it so much better in the second 100 instruments. Not that those weren't great instruments, but the longer he built, the more consistently he understood the products Mother Nature gave him and was able to consistently tune those instruments to their final perspective. It takes a little bit more understanding from investors in companies that build these instruments. It's not the fast return on investment that we've come to expect from Wall Street. It's not exponential growth, but very slow growth, and making sure that the consumers and the producers understand the value of maintaining this really unusual art form that is building musical instruments. And of course, it takes an audience to understand and appreciate what an instrument should sound like versus what we've just come to accept it should sound like. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and let you hear a little bit more of what a handmade instrument should sound like tonally and dynamically. Thank you.